Hello and welcome to Everything's All Right, a bi-monthly podcast for authors and writers with tips, tricks, and challenges to level up your writing skills. I am aslewis, your host, guide, and guru for all things word-related. I'm a published science fiction and fantasy author, a published nonfiction author, and a fan fiction enthusiast, which means I'm also a really big nerd. For the past several years, I've been writing everything from multi-million-dollar grant proposals to sci-fi novels to ghostwriting for national leaders and politicians to spoken word poetry and anything and, well, everything in between. And I'm here to help you improve your writing, no matter what type of writing that is. And who doesn't want to get better? So let's get right to it. Welcome to the latest episode of Everything's All Right podcast. Today we're going to talk about chapters, particularly chapter endings. So, beginning at the beginning, as we always do, what is a chapter? Well, you probably already have an intuitive feeling of what a chapter is and what a chapter is not, but let's put some concrete walls around these ideas. Chapters are the divisions within a novel that help support the pace, structure, and frame the general flow of action throughout a novel. Short stories, by their nature of being short, don't need chapters in the way a novel does. To put it simply, a short story is often read in one sitting. A novel is not. Because at the end of the day, no matter how wonderful a novel is, most people are not going to want to sit down and read 500 pages without taking a break. In a sense, chapters are both a way for the author and the reader to set the pace at which a novel is both dispensed and received. What this means for you as a writer is that your chapter planning should reflect the story arc, the action, and the pacing of that action within your piece. I personally like to think of chapters as segments in a TV show, and chapter breaks are the commercial breaks. They give the reader a chance to digest what has been read, to take a break from, or maybe they need to go to the bathroom, or lets the previous chapter kind of sing on its own and resonate before jumping into something else. For an author, it can be a way of organizing your outline. I don't personally predetermine chapter length. I let the chapter length determine itself once I get writing. In that way, I'm kind of like a pantster writer, but I always begin writing for any chapter with a particular goal or set of goals in mind. For example, in this chapter, I may want Lincoln to apply for a job, get denied, and return home to an empty house. When I begin writing my chapter, I will have those goals in mind as I write. Each time I check off one of those goals as being met, it's because I've written that scene or a particular action into existence. I know I'm making progress on the intended purpose of the chapter. But anything that occurs organically as I write the character going through these actions, I keep as a part of the flavor of the chapter. I don't dictate the descriptive nuance, the encounters, or the dialogue per se, but I do want to make sure that the purpose of my chapter is met. Anything outside of the primary purpose that arises organically usually adds depth and tension to my chapter in ways not always foreseen, and often that is where the magic happens. This is where you usually have questions like, how long should my chapter be? Well, there are websites that will tell you specifically that if your book is X number of pages long, or if you're writing a horror story, that each chapter should be X number of pages. Personally, I do not subscribe to those formulaic interpretations. Chapters, as you can see in the various wide array of published books, can vary dramatically in chapter length. However, they rarely vary in chapter purpose. Chapters generally share a positive correlation with your plot outline, and you should follow the flow of the action regardless of the number of words or pages that each chapter may be broken into. If a one-page chapter works in the flow of your novel, then leave it be. If a 20-page chapter works in the flow of your novel, also leave it be. And both chapters can coexist in your novel. Chapter lengths can vary greatly between the confines of your covers. Don't be afraid of that. Chapters are kind of like the rhythmic clanking of a roller coaster. The roller coaster is mechanical and therefore all the clanks are equidistant to one another, but they are building towards a single purpose. Your chapter is doing the same thing, but it doesn't have to be as mechanical and metronomic as a roller coaster is, because it's an organic and creative work. Therefore, varying lengths are absolutely appropriate. Now, some people will tell you that each chapter should be a story unto itself, with its own mini arc of a problem, conflict, and resolution. I also do not follow this line of thought. Though most of my chapters do follow that outline, I simply don't require them to do so. I prefer a method where the characters kind of dictate for themselves where is a good break and what pacing is best to accomplish what they need to accomplish. Once again, as long as I can check off those goals that represent the purpose for writing this chapter, I'm satisfied. And that purpose is not always conflict. The purpose could be informative, introductory, explanatory, or be used for foreshadowing. As long as the purpose is met, then you should be in good stead. As far as how to end it appropriately, I find most of my writing kind of comes to a natural point of conclusion that feels good as a chapter break. You want to end your chapters in such a way that it doesn't disrupt or break the mounting tension or mood that you have created. But aside from that, you can break it wherever it feels natural. As I mentioned earlier, I think of chapter endings as commercial breaks. They give the reader a chance to digest what they've read and provides a safe space to pause for the day. I don't know about you, but I truly, truly hate bookmarking in the middle of a chapter. I have a feeling of completion and order when I can place that bookmark at the end of a chapter. But that's just part of the way my crazy brain thinks. But part of it is practical in the sense that if a bookmark is lost or dislodged, it is far easier to find your place at the end of chapter 23 as opposed to 2 paragraphs down on page 467. Now that we've had the basics of what a chapter is, what a chapter does, and how you should approach it, let's look at those tasks in a very practical manner. But don't worry, as usual, I have a few tips and tricks that will help you along the way. Here are some tips and tricks to help you create the perfect chapter. Tip number 1. If you're a planner, then I would say start with your outline. Identify your story segments and cut them into possible chapters that correlate to the sections of your outline. Use these as guideposts to both indicate the likely number of chapters you will have, but more importantly, to note the pacing of those chapters towards the inevitable conclusion of your story. Tip number 2. If you're not the kind of writer that outlines your entire novel at the beginning, that's okay. What you can do as you sit down to write each chapter is plan out what the purpose of that chapter is. What are the specific goals or actions or interactions you expect to see in this chapter? This can be a very short bullet list, almost a laundry list of actions that you will follow. As long as you meet those actions, then your characters should be successful in its purpose. And that means your chapter will be successful in its purpose. However, this does not mean you should write your chapter as a way of simply ticking off those items on your list. Indeed, your chapter can still address its purpose, but when you experience that creative explosion and impulses you feel when you're writing, they should still be followed because they create the meat that surrounds the bones that are the purpose of your chapter. If you don't, you end up with a skeleton, and skeletons are not nearly as interesting or engaging to read as fully fleshed out plots or characters. Tip number 3. Don't be so rigid with your outline or your goals to not allow for that creative disruption. If you find yourself elbow deep in a chapter and you feel the flow of that story moving in a slightly different path than you planned, that's not necessarily a problem. If you plan for the protagonist to visit their mother in this chapter, but as you're writing it, you feel the need to include a bank robbery, and your protagonist is caught in the lobby. You don't have to speed through this scene just to get to the one where he meets his mother. Let the robbery scene grow, and you can move that chapter goal of meeting the mother to the next chapter. Set a new goal regarding what you want to accomplish now in the robbery scene. Now, when you get to the end of your writing, when you've finished your entire book and it's time to start the editing process, you may go back and realize the bank robbery scene simply doesn't flow. It seemed to work in the moment, but it no longer applies. Well, then this is the time you would edit or remove it entirely. But never throw it away. If I've never said it before, let me say it plainly now. Never actually trash deleted scenes, lines, characters, or plots. Put them in a folder somewhere. Save them in a file. I call my file the graveyard. In the future, I can all but promise you that you'll find wonderful gems for future writings, often returning to your graveyard and resurrecting pieces that didn't work for one project but blend beautifully for another. Tip number 4. Know when to end your chapter. These are small book segments, therefore they can't go on forever. I like ending on a note of tension or a note of resolution, or, in some rare cases, a note of intense emotional turmoil that can't easily be dealt with. But my absolute favorite ending? It's the mini cliffhanger. That approach is particularly useful in books and novels where you're going to switch scenes dramatically in the next chapter or shift POVs because while you're providing new information and a new interesting plot thread to follow, the reader can't help but wonder what's going to happen when they return to the previous plot line or the previous character. This means they are invested in that tension and they want to follow it through. But at the end of the day, I choose to think of chapter endings as commercial breaks. I'm sure that most of us have watched enough TV at this point in our lives that we can kind of intuit where that temporary pause is going to be. And once you can do that for a show that you're watching, you can definitely apply the same criteria to your book. It doesn't even require a detailed knowledge of what that criterion is. You know it when you feel it, and when you feel it, it's time to end the chapter. We have discussed what a chapter is, how it functioned, and even how to go about creating the best possible chapter for your book. I think it's time we take on a challenge. Here is your bi-weekly Wordsmith Challenge. This episode's weekly challenge will be slightly different from those of previous episodes. What I'd like you to do is to give a short bullet-pointed outline of your goals for one of your chapters. As mentioned earlier, this can be a short list of actions, interactions, reactions, or other points of explanation or information that you need to get across to your reader within this small segment of your book. Whatever your purpose is, identify it for me in a short bulleted list and then give just a few sentences on how you think this chapter will end. Nothing fancy required, just a few sentences of explanations or expectations. Once you've done that, you can send it to me at aslewisbooks@gmail.com. The best examples will be highlighted in a future episode and posted on the website. And speaking of the best examples, here are the previous winners for setting description and character voice. Eric K., setting winner. The grove of trees was verdant and pulsing with energy. The air seemed to grow even as the leaves rustled in a slight breeze. There was a chill in the air, a suggestion of winter, but it came with no force and was easily ignored by people. But leaves had already begun to die and fell to the ground at the notion of cold. Other plants were more rebellious and continued to chant, grow. Summer had ended. Autumn was waking and dancing, but winter was stirring. Ken B., character voice. Gerald was a hard man from a hard life. He would tell people that. He would tell them that he was hard. He would say that he walked hard and hot roads to school. that his father's hard hat was his most favorite possession. He would explain how his hard and callous hands were hated by his girlfriends, but loved by his dog, Buddy. Yes, Gerald would say everything about him was hard, but Gerald would be lying. Congratulations, Eric and Ken. Keep up the good work. Remember, if you send in your work, it could be featured on another episode of the podcast. And if you don't want to share your work, that's okay too. The important thing is that you're writing and trying something new. That's how writing gets better. Even if you hate what you wrote, I promise you the practice will pay off. If you've enjoyed the show and would like to hear more, please click subscribe so you never miss an episode. Keep writing and remember, everything's all right.